Okay, so I'll just share my screen again. All right, so when we want to start working with Photoshop, I'll just open up this file here, and I'm going to set this to Essentials. Just reset that, just so that basically, so you've got what I've got here. We don't need the libraries at the moment. We'll just hide that. So everybody knows that you can put layers and do different things in Photoshop. But as some of you are doing illustration, what you probably didn't know is that we can go over to Illustrator, and I'll just open up this robot, and I can take this vector image and just copy that. So let's just Control-Command-C. Go over into Photoshop. Now if I press Command-N for New, go File, New, and what it'll do, it should actually take the clipboard size. So that's what it's got there, so 441. And I'm going to create a new page and paste that into my document. Now it'll give you some options. So because a lot of you are doing sort of illustrative work as well, we can either paste that in as pixels, or we can paste it as a path, a shape layer, and probably the most useful is a smart object. So if we paste that in, and I'll just reduce the size a bit. So now we have our vector art inside our inside our Photoshop document. And if you go over here, you can see you've got vector smart object. Now, because this is kind of mucked up in here, I want to fix that. So rather than go back to Illustrator, re-import, and do everything, I can just right-click on here, and we can say Edit Original, or sorry, Edit Contents. Now, what will happen? It'll come into Illustrator. So I might want to change that. Let's drag that back there and save that. Then when I go back into Photoshop, it'll fix it. Okay, so there's this link between smart objects and Photoshop. So if, for example, we wanted to change the color of this, we can just go back to our smart object and select select all the same color. And change it to I have to open up my color. I just got to change it back to Essentials. So now I can change the color down here. Okay. Change those colors as well. Save that. Now I'm going to go back to Photoshop. It should change. Actually, I have to save, I think. That was the problem. There you go. All right, so there's this relationship between Illustrator and Photoshop that you can update your graphics without having to re-import them all the time. So that can be quite useful. Now what you find is when you're starting to do these illustrations, actually I'll come back to this when I talk about layer masks in a second. All right, so let's look at an image. So let's open up just a normal image. So what I've got is a couple of images that are that I shot when I was away. And what you'll find is if you're shooting raw, basically you've got an increased, you can have increased stops of color value or tonal value. So if you have a sorry, if you have a raw image, you'll get this box come up before you bring it into Photoshop. And you notice that in here you've got a lot of detail missing, and we can actually bring some of that information back. Okay, so I can actually look at this, and we can actually just decrease that. So what's happening is that shooting a raw image allows you to capture more data. So I'll open that image, and now we've got a sort of a standard image that we can now manipulate. If we just open up a JPEG, let's just open up this image. Okay, so now you can see that you've got just a standard image, just a JPEG file. Now, one of the most critical things to look at whenever you open up your photographs that you've taken, or however you bring them from your camera into Photoshop, just have a look at the tonal values. Now, what I'm going to do is actually open up the levels up here. So these control your contrast. So if nobody's seen this before, this is basically what's called a histogram. So what this is doing is showing you the value of the pixels from the darkest on the left-hand side to the brightest. So this is called a low-key image. And if I open up another image, just to show you the difference. Just copy that. Remember that this histogram looks like this. Now, if I do the same thing for this image, can you see the difference? So here you can see that all the values are up on the right-hand side. So ideally, for a well-exposed image, which should look something like perhaps that one, probably not. Let's find a well-exposed image. Okay, so let's see the difference with that one. So you can see that a lot of the values are in the middle. So normally what happens is a good image will start at 0 here and then gradually increase up to sort of a high value here and then down to there. So your highlight point, so this is a highlight point and this is a shadow point. So what that means is that whenever we move these sliders, you can see the image gets a lot darker. Okay, so what I'm doing, if I hold down the Option key and I click and drag, you can see where the points are in the image are black. So if I take it to there, and you can see now that the black is all filled in. Now what happens when you do that with an image, you're losing information. So the image isn't going to be as good. Okay, so what we're really looking for is just starting to get some nice blacks in here. And this is all chunky because it's a JPEG image. Okay, so that's where you get the artifacts. And then if you do the same with the highlight, you can see that the whitest part is in here. So I'm just holding down the Option key. Now with a well-exposed image, which I'll try and find, maybe this one. Okay, you can see now that there's actually some space in here and there's some space in there. So what that means is that you have control over where the black point is in that image. So if I do the same thing, hold down the Option key, which is just the Alt key on a PC, and I just click and drag, you can see now where the black starts to come in. Okay, so you can have a lot of control. So when you take your photos off your camera, it's always absolutely imperative that you actually go through this process and adjust the tones so that you get the maximum information out of your image. Otherwise, if you just bring it in as you took it off the camera, you find that you'll actually be missing out on getting more detail in there. And same token, we can just do the highlight, and then eventually, so now you can see the whitest parts. Okay, now where we used to do this was when you're printing a document, if you have completely black in one of those areas, the printing machine will actually fill in all those colours and it looks all muddy. If you don't have any tone in the highlights, you get a really sharp step off of contrast, so to go almost like a tone dropout. And then if you find that that looks too dark, we can now use the middle slider to brighten it up a bit. And this is to your taste. Okay, so you set the shadow point and the highlight point, and then adjust the gamma to suit what you want it to do. So that's kind of the easiest way that you can get your photos looking better. What I'll do is in here, rather than go through that process and feed okay there, what I'm doing is actually destroying the image because I'm doing it actually on the pixels themselves. A much better way of working with Photoshop is to use adjustment layers. So what that means is that we can go down to this little button down here, and we can actually do the same thing. So we can have a levels adjustment layer, and you can see now that it's actually created a new layer there, and we can do exactly the same thing. Okay, so we can adjust that to how we want. So I'll hold down the Option key again, find out that I want that detail in there, and then adjust that like that. Now the difference is that our image is actually hasn't been affected because this is just an adjustment layer. So we can turn that off. Okay, so and we'll get into layer masks now. And what that means is that it's non-destructive. So that means we don't actually have to change the pixels of our image because you really want to keep the original. Now, whenever you bring in a JPEG, make sure that you export out as another JPEG. Don't save that JPEG because JPEG is a what's called a lossy compression algorithm. So that means that every time you save it, it's going to reduce the quality until you end up with a bunch of bricks. So just bear in mind that every time you open up a JPEG, save it out as something else. A good idea is to have one original file, which is usually a Photoshop file, because that doesn't compress, and then save out JPEGs from there. Okay, so let's get rid of this levels, and I'm just going to show you another way of adjusting the tonal value, which I use all the time because it has a lot more control. Now, levels are the simplest way. I mean, you can use auto contrast, auto tone, but brightness, contrast. So this is the one you want to use the most, which is curves. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer for curves. And you can see they've got exactly the same deal. So we've got our highlight point and our shadow point. And then we've got this graph line in the middle. So we adjust our highlight and shadow. And then we can use this to really start messing with those tonal values. Okay, so we can actually have a lot more control over how that image looks. So levels don't allow you to do that. They just have those 3 sliders and that's it. Whereas curves, I can actually go into each color and adjust that curve as well. Okay, so you've got a lot of control with curves. So by default, I would sort of learn to use the curves. But if you get stuck, then just go back to levels. You can even draw on here. So you can just go, I want this curve to go a little wacky. And then you get something that's completely different. We'll go opposite. So you can see that, there's quite a few different ways that you can control things. And these presets can be fun. But learning that little thing there with the shadow point and the highlight point is really going to help you. All right, so let's get rid of that for now. Okay, so one of the main things we use Photoshop is to montage photos together. So, for example, we've got an image here. Now, what if we wanted to put, that image inside her face here? I would use this face over here. So, first thing I would do is actually duplicate that layer, which is Command J, or you can drag that onto the little plus thing down there. So I always try and duplicate the layer that I want to play with, simply because I can always go back to the original. And I'll just put that one down below and turn off the visibility. All right, so we've got our image over the top, and I'm going to put this face, I want this face to be behind that temple there. And you can sort of go up to the the selection tool, which I'll go through in a second. So you can make a selection, and you can even invert that selection, which I'll go into in a minute. And if you press delete, that's great. Okay, only trouble is now we've actually deleted the pixels from our image. So what that means is that we can't get those back. Okay, so that's not the best idea. So I'll just delete that layer, duplicate my other layer again, and what we want is another way that we can actually mask out your particular layer. Now, with Photoshop, it's all based on selections. So how you select your elements is really critical. There's a couple of ways that we can do selections. So if we go up to our rectangle selection, which is Shift M, and that toggles between the circle and the rectangle. Okay, so if I go rectangle, if I draw a rectangle, it's just like Illustrator, hold the Shift key down to constrain it to a square, and then hold the space bar down to constrain or to let me move it around before I commit. Okay, so we make a selection. Now, obviously, this is only selecting this area here, but we want to select the face. Okay, so there's a couple of ways that we can do that. Up in here, so just going back to this, you can draw rectangles and circles, single rows, single columns as well. So with our Lasso tool here, we zoom in a bit in here. Okay, so this is basically like a pen. So we can actually just click and drag and draw selections like that, which can be useful. But if you want to draw something in this shape, you've got to use kind of a combination of things. So we can start drawing our shape like this, and then if you hold down the Option or the Alt key, you can see that it now turns into like a rubber band selection tool. So now we can actually just click, and each time I click, it's like the pen to an Illustrator. So you just click, and I can actually manipulate that so that we get, a fairly acceptable selection. Okay, and what you find is that, that's a fairly tedious way to do selections. It's very accurate, but it can be a little bit tedious. So if I want to deselect this, I just press Command or Control D, and then under this Lasso tool, there's also the magnetic lasso tool. So now what that does, that works on selecting color values. So if I just drag that, around here kind of, you can see that it's actually kind of sticking to And then there's actually, see that little close loop. Okay, so you can see that it's kind of done. Okay. Now, if you want to add to a selection, we hold down the Shift key. So you can see that it turns into a plus. If I want to subtract, you hold down the Option key. So if I want to select this bit extra, I just hold down the Shift and then go there, and then that will select a bit more. Now that too can get really tedious. So let's see if there's a better way. So if we actually go back to our normal lasso tool and just do a really rough, almost like a garbage selection. So it's just, you're not actually selecting much at all. So you're just kind of in the general vicinity. And if you look up here, you've got select and mask. So what this does, it takes you to another window which has different ways of selecting areas. Now, if we turn Smart Radius on, what that does, that will help us to soften off this edge a bit. So if I just use this as a paintbrush, so to get any paintbrush in Photoshop, whether it be the clone tool, the brush tool, whatever it is, if I use the square bracket, so I'm using the left square bracket, which is up near the delete key, that makes the paintbrush smaller. The right square bracket makes it bigger. So you know I love keyboard shortcuts, so I use that all the time, and that's one of those ones that you can't really beat in terms of speed. You can go up in here and change the size there too if you want, but yeah, if you want to. Okay, so if I just start dragging this around, so I'm clicking and dragging, and you can see that it's kind of selecting areas up here. Now, because I've gone over here, if I hold down the Option key, so you can see that normally by default it's on plus, but if I hold the Option key down, it will actually turn to a negative. So what I'm going to do is actually delete this again, and then go like that. So it looks a bit rough there, but what it does, it's selecting between contiguous areas of the pixels. So that means that it's really, if this is obviously this is like a grayscale image, so it's not finding very good contrast between those pixels. That's why it looks a bit rough on the edges here, but it's not too bad. So we'll just go through and do it again. Okay, so I want to take that out of there, bring that down there. Okay, so once we've got that, so I mean it's not great, but okay, so if you've got a really good selection, once you've got that, let's just take that out, and we hit OK. And what it's going to do is output to a selection. Okay, so if we output to a selection, that means that on our document, we've now got our layer with these marching ants with that selection. Now, once you've got that selection, what you can do is actually go down to here and just click on that little button down there. So this is our layer mask button. So add layer mask. And what that does, that automatically turns that into a masked layer. Now, if we look at this mask itself, so I'll go up to channels. So what a layer mask is that everywhere that's white is opaque and everywhere that's black is clear, it's transparent. So if you've got a 50% grey, then it's semi-permanent, semi-transparent. So that means that it's half and half. So we can use this to our advantage. So if we go back to our layer mask, go back to our layers, and always make sure that you've got the actual layer mask selected. So you can see that this one has the border now. So if I start using my paintbrush, I'm actually going to paint into the layer. But you notice when I click on the layer mask here, this changes to black and white. So I've got a black foreground and a white background. Now, to change those over, to swap them, we just press the X key. And that'll be really helpful when you start using a paintbrush to control your layer masks, because sometimes you want to paint into the mask, sometimes you want to detract from the mask. So if I want to paint into the mask, I use white. If I want to take away, I use black. So let's just try it with the white first. And so at the moment, it's just pure white. So now you can see they're actually painting into our image. Okay, that could be a nice, neat image. Okay, so what's happening here is that we're actually painting white into that layer mask, and that means that the actual the opacity is changing according to what that is. So if I change this, just as an example, I'll make this say, I don't know, 40%. If I paint down here now, you can see that it's just doing it at 40%. Okay, so that's one roll over 40%. If I do it again, then it'll just keep it at 40%. So let's change this back to white. And then if I just hit the X key and go to black, and now I can actually paint that part of the image out of it. If I make this brush really big, you can see that we can get some really soft montaging like that. Okay, so, you know, and once again, if we use our selection tools, so let's just say we want to select this piece. Okay, so once you've got that, you can either go up to here and go fill, which is Shift F5, fill with foreground color, click OK, and then that will then fill that with solid black, which makes that transparent. But a much easier way is if we actually select an area. Okay, and then all I have to do is press Option or Alt Delete, and that just fills it with black. If I swap that over to the white, do the same thing, then it's Option and it fills it in. Option Delete fills it in. Okay. So now what you'll notice is that if we start going over here, and I'll just fill that back to what it is. Okay, so what I want to do is select this area here. And when you have a selection and you're trying to blend that seamlessly into the background, what we do is we put a bit of feather on that selection. So if we go up to Select and we go Modify Feather, so that's Shift F6, and we want to feather that 1 pixel. Okay, so I'm going to fill that with black, and you'll see that what that does is actually make it a bit soft between our this area here. So where it's going into the layer below, it has a slight softening. So it kind of interpolates between, you know, this value and this value. So that means that the image below isn't a harsh, if you compare the difference, it's not a harsh join. So let's just make this one, let's just try it across the top here. Okay, so you can see that up here, it's a lot more stepped. Now this will be more noticeable when you have a low resolution image, because obviously the pixels are bigger. So that's why we always use 300 dpi images. Okay. All right, let's see. Sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts. Okay. All right, so that's how we kind of montage those things together. Now, what we can do, so let's just drag this over here, and to change the size of this, we can go up to Edit and go Free Transform, or you can go Command or Control T. and then you can actually change the size of this. Now, if you don't hold the shift key down, it kind of is a bit counterintuitive. It scales proportionally. If you hold the shift key down, it doesn't. It scales in, in free proportion. Okay, so let's bring that down there, and let's just bring that into there. Now, what I want to do is maybe have her behind on the mountain, and just go from there. All right, so I want to have to excuse the noise. I'm going to paint. So, we probably have a bit of a job trying to, match this to the edge of the temple here. So, as with anything in Photoshop, as I was saying before, it's really about selection. So let's go to this object here. So we'll go to our original photo, and we're going to use another tool called the magic wand, or the quick selection tool. So what that lets you do is basically just click and drag, and then it'll find the best selection for you. So once again, we can use the square bracket to go up and down a size, and then we just keep clicking around until we find the bits of the image that we want. Once again, so you can see down here, we're kind of getting close, so reduce the brush size, and then we can get a bit more detail. And you notice here we've got a bit of a hole here, so now we just hold the Option key down and we'll get into there. All right, so what we've got is just a selection on that building. Now, any selection you make in Photoshop, you can transfer to another layer. So let's just go back over here, and I'm just going to delete, no I'm not, because then I won't get it back. All right, so what I'm going to do is, you can see they've actually transferred that. Because that selection's still going, if I go up to my layer here, and I press Option Delete to fill it in. Okay, I don't want that, I want the opposite. Okay, and now I'm going to select, sorry, I'll go through that again. So there you can see that I've filled that in with opaque. So what I'm doing is just bringing back the sort of the robot image there. I'll change that to black. Now I'm pressing Option Delete to fill that with black so it's clear. And now what I want to do is actually invert that mask. So that means that if I paint on something, it's going to paint into this area here rather than this area. So if you go to Select and go Inverse, okay, now I can paint, so using the brush tool. So now let's change that back to white, and I can actually paint that back into there. Okay, because I've got that selection from that original image there. So now we can make it look a bit more interesting. So you can see that, by just using, simple selections, you can get some interesting things. Obviously this selection would have really benefited from having a bit of feathering on it, just so that it goes back in a bit easier. All right, now one thing that we can do as well, if we have our layer, so now you can see I've selected our normal layer. If we create a hue saturation adjustment layer, and we adjust this, so let's colorize it so that we've got some nice blue going on, and really saturate it. Now what you'll notice is that layer is actually affecting the whole image. Now we only want it on this background layer, on the girl. So to do that, if you go over here to the layers palette here and hold down the Option or Alt key, now you notice the icon changes. So if I click on that little icon, so I'm just holding the Option key down and just dragging over the two, that line. Now you can see that it's only affecting this layer, okay? And the beauty of it is that, you know, hopefully you can recognize now we have what is in here is a layer mask. So we can actually use the same idea of transparency and opacity to now actually control that color as well. Okay, so there's lots of ways that you can use layer masks to, you know, really isolate your items. Now, just say, for example, we wanted to do a curves layer on here as well. So we just go curves. So now it's affecting, so let's turn that into a high key image perhaps. Okay, now once again, you can see it's affecting the whole image. And all we have to do is just Option, click on that line, and now it only affects that one image. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes some sense. All right, so I've got some other images here. So there's our original. This is one I wanted to show you. So let's say we've got our image, and sometimes I'll actually open up that other, because I kind of destroyed it. It's okay, I'll use that one. Go back through here and just get back to what it was. So I broke my own rule of not saving the actual original.
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt.
All right.
Did you actually import a PNG or JPEG image and then use free transform? Probably like Control T if I remember.
Yes, I did.
Or warp.
Now, if I hit, so I've actually imported this. This is meant to be a nice square image. But if I hit Command T, which is the same as going up to transform, free transform. So Command T, and I can just hold down the Command key, and then I can actually distort this image. So if I don't hold down the Command or Control key, it'll just scale it proportionally. But if I hold down the Command key, it'll distort it as well. So what I want to do is basically just put a tattoo on her arm there. So I'm just going to kind of distort this. There's lots of other ways you can do this, but just for now. So just kind of pretending that it's meant to sit kind of there. All right, so when you bring a JPEG in, what you find is, usually you have like a white background with a, with some black text on there. Now, Photoshop uses what's called blending modes. Now, what blending modes do is allow you to control the way that the pixels react with the pixels below. So with this layer, if I go up to here, it says normal now. If I turn this to multiply, you can see that what happens is that all the white disappears. So what multiply does is that any value that's below 50% will go black. Any value that's above 50% will go white. So what that means is we can do really, really nice shadows. So just to show you, let's use one of these robots. It'll do. I'll just copy that and then drag that. I'll put it down here so it's above there. just I'm just going to create a shadow for this. So to do that, I'm just going to draw into a new layer. So if I just click over here, little plus button, all that does is create a new layer. I'm just going to call this one Robot Shadow. And I'm just going to actually use my Lasso tool and just draw shadow, and then I want to fill that with black. So I just select black up here and then Option Delete, and then that'll fill that with black. All right, so not a very convincing shadow at the moment. Let's just soften that up a little bit. So we can use the blur tool here.
With shadows though, isn't it better or easier to just go into the blending options, whatever it's called, and it has like the shadow options and all that stuff?
Blending options, you mean like multiply? Or you mean this one, the drop shadow?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
Okay, so if I do drop shadow, okay, so my shadow, I'm going to drop shadow, hang on. So,
yeah, I just figured that would be like a faster way of doing it.
Depends on your shadow. It's a faster way if all you want to do is have him, this one. Okay, so if we put a drop shadow on here, what happens is that it'll just do, it's like he's on a flat background. Okay, so, which is okay if you're just having him on a background, but the shadow I had was he was going across this way. Now we can actually a good experiment here. Maybe there's something else. Hang on. Create layer. That's the one. Okay, so create layer. Okay. And what should have happened? We should have got just our shadow now. Okay, so now we can just take the shadow and then we can just transform that shadow. So we're still getting kind of the shape, but we're able to change the way it looks as well. So, you know, that drop shadow does have a lot of potential to do that kind of thing. But what I wanted to show you was that now we've got that, we can actually set that to multiply, which it is by default, and we can change the percentage. So that means they're actually affecting how this this shadow is affected in here. Now, sometimes to get a bit of a better sense of realism, what we need to do is actually create like multiple shadows. So in this instance, I'll just copy this this layer, and you can see that it actually got a lot darker. So if we add a layer mask to this, making sure it's better. Okay, so if we do that, and now you can see we've kind of got this gradual fall off of the shadow. So it's a lot more realistic than just having one shadow. So having multiple shadows allows you to control that intensity so that it looks a bit more realistic than just having one flat shadow in there. I mean, you could even duplicate this again. Okay, so drop shadow is just kind of the default way that we can, you know, create a shadow for this guy. Okay, so if you want that on a sort of fairly flat background, then drop shadow works fine in that case. But because we want to make this a little bit more interesting, if you go over here and right click on that FX there, you can go create layer. So what that'll do, that will take that shadow and turn that into a new layer. By making that a new layer, which is what it's done. So now you can see that This is our shadow layer. Okay, so now we can take this shadow, and in order to make it, distort it, we have to hold down our command or our control key, and then we can drag that and then manipulate that so that it fits. So obviously, it might be a bit of perspective. Okay, so now we've got one shadow. So that's set to multiply. And if we change our opacity, because we don't want the shadow to be really strong all the way back, because of the nature of light, it always falls off. So what we want to do is actually set this to, say, 50%. Okay. And I mean, we can blur this a bit more, but if that's set to 50%, and now we duplicate that layer, okay, drag that down there. So now this is actually doing sort of double. So you've got two lots of 50%. But if we add a layer mask to this duplicated layer, and then paint, make this transparent, you can see now that we get a much nicer looking shadow. Let's just turn these off, and let's go back to our, let's just find a black and white logo. Okay, that'll do. So let's bring that into Photoshop. So it's not coming in because that layer is not visible. So if we do it down here, it'll come in there. So it's actually coming as a transparent. So it's probably a PNG file or something. All right. So let's just make that look a little bit more. So you can also rotate things as well. Okay. So if we go back to our multiply, change opacity, and you can see that now we can kind of have that starting to fill in, looking like it's in skin. Now, if you want to color this transparent object, so if you look at that, all that is just a PNG. So wherever the checkerboard is, it's just transparent. Now, if you go up to here and go lock, so click on that little button there. Now what this does, that locks the pixels, if you like, but we can still fill that with a color. So let's make it a different color. So Option Delete. Now you can see that we've now got a different colored star. So by locking that layer, we can still change the color of the pixel. So all it's doing is affecting the pixels that are on, that have a value. So anything that's zero value, it won't affect. All right, so that's one way you can do that. Now the other way, so I'll just make it black again. Okay, so another useful trick is that if we invert this, so instead of it being black, it's going to be white. So we go up to image. I'm so used to just putting Command I or Control I. So if we go here, go invert. So now that's disappeared because we've actually made that logo white now. So that means that because we're on multiply, white is transparent. So if we change this back to normal, we now have a white circle. So what if you had a situation where so let's look at that one. That's a cool tattoo. So copy that. So let's just turn that star off. So once again, I'm just taking this down to here. Okay, so what if we wanted to make that into a white tattoo? So once again, we can use our blending modes. So we use our blending modes here, and instead of having multiply, we can go down to these other ones, screen. Now with screen, what happens is that everything that's 50% and above goes white, and 50% below goes black. Now because this image is a black on white, we need to invert that. So if we go back up to our image and then go adjustments, invert, now you can see that we have a white image on there. Okay, so using blending layers or using blending modes and the way that the pixels interact with layers below is really helpful in helping you to really sort of start putting your montages and things together. Okay, so let's go to, promise this is the last one. It's been epic. All right, so let's actually I'll just so what I've got here is I've actually separated out the pieces of the robot, some better than others. There's a bit of a problem there, but anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Okay, so we've separated those two bits of the image. Now with any kind of illustrative work that you're doing, sometimes it's nice to put a texture on your illustration just to make it look a bit more sort of analog, not so flat and digital. So at the moment it's quite flat. There's no real texture in there. So if we go up to our, just search for texture. Yeah, you can find textures online, which is fine. Okay, so let's find a texture that we, I'll just do a paper texture even. So if you search for a paper texture, and that looks pretty fine. Let's get a bit more of a noisy texture so you can see it a bit better. That's a good one. Okay, so let's copy that over. And I'm going to paste this. Maybe I should look for large images, sorry. Okay, so here's a sort of a corky texture. Better. Okay, so I'm just going to reduce that in size a bit just so it looks a little bit more appropriate on there. Okay, so what I want to do is actually take some of the color out of this initially. Well, actually, I'll leave it there and just see how we go. All right, so what we want to do is actually create a layer mask that goes around this particular robot body and then put the texture over the top. So a really easy way that you can make a selection here, because the robot is actually just on a black, on a transparent background. If we hold down the Command or Control key, and you can see that that icon changes to a little dotted line. If we hold down the Control or Command and click, what will happen is whatever's transparent on here, or whatever's a solid pixel in here will be selected. So now we can go to our texture, and we can now say layer mask. And if we drag that above our robot, now we have a texture on our robot. So this is where we can use blending modes. So let's go screen. And, really it's just about playing around and seeing what it is you want to do, what you're happy with. So you can just go through these. So that's a pretty neat one. So that kind of gives it a real interesting look. And, a lot more interesting than just that. Okay, so I really encourage you to play around with textures and to really, you know, have a look at blending modes and see if you can use those to help you. Okay, so I'm probably going to stop there.